Good evening, and thank you for joining us tonight. I'm Rachel Maddow, and what we are witnessing right now inside Russia is not just political turbulence, not just economic uncertainty, not just elite anxiety. It is the slow, grinding, irreversible unraveling of a regime that once claimed it could outlast any storm. Tonight, the world is watching something Vladimir Putin insisted would never happen. The foundations of his power, the empire of loyalty and iron-fisted control he built over 2 decades, are beginning to crack under their own weight. And unlike past crises, this time the threat is not coming from NATO, not from sanctions, not from protesters in the street, not even from the battlefield. It is coming from the very people who helped Putin build his throne. Russia's oligarchs, its billionaire class, its financial kingmakers, and its silent business elites. For years, these were the men who toasted Putin's victories on yachts the size of naval vessels, conducted business deals worth more than the GDP of small nations, and sat in private boardrooms where decisions rewired the veins of the Russian economy. They were the regime's prized assets, the proof that Russia could thrive, win, and dominate the global stage through wealth, not just weaponry. They were not merely beneficiaries, they were pillars. But pillars, when cracked, do not bend, they collapse. Over the past months, reports inside and outside Russia have pointed to something the Kremlin does not want the world to see: the quiet exodus of Russia's ultra-wealthy, not vacation travel, not temporary business relocation escape, abrupt departures, emergency property transfers, offshore asset withdrawals, encrypted communications, and diplomatic inquiries for residency rights in safe, non-extradition territories. Because when a regime built on loyalty begins to show signs of instability, the elite do not wait for the collapse, they run from it. But to truly understand why this moment matters, we need to step back to the origins of Putin's kingdom. When Vladimir Putin rose to power at the turn of the millennium, he inherited a Russia fractured by post-Soviet chaos. The privatization frenzy of the 1,990 seconds produced a generation of tycoons who controlled factories, energy empires, media networks, mineral reserves, and banking systems. They were powerful, they were rich, and in theory, they were above the government. Putin changed that in a single sentence: "You stay out of politics, and I'll let you keep everything." It was the most consequential handshake in modern Russian history. The oligarchs agreed. And from that day on, the Kremlin learned it didn't need to fight the rich, it needed only to own the leash. Putin used fear not as punishment, but as policy. If an oligarch stepped out of line, he didn't just lose his wealth, he disappeared. And everyone understood that silence was the safest currency. For 20 years, the pact held. The money flowed, the regime flourished. Luxury became the quiet anthem of the Kremlin's inner circle villas, supercars, satellites, mansions, mistresses, private chefs, and fleets of private aircraft. As long as loyalty was absolute, the good times remained infinite. But then came sanctions, war, isolation, frozen assets, seized yachts, canceled visas, blocked accounts. Suddenly, the billionaire class that once lived above the clouds found themselves stranded on the ground. The golden passport was now a liability, not a privilege. At first, they believed the storm would pass. They believed Russia, as always, would endure. They believed the Kremlin would negotiate, maneuver, or intimidate its way back into global markets. But instead, the storm kept growing, and the Kremlin kept denying its own vulnerability. The oligarchs began noticing the warning signs long before the public did. Their Western lawyers stopped returning calls. Their international banks issued compliance freezes. Their business partners began drafting exit clauses. Their children abroad were interrogated about family wealth. Their property managers whispered, "It's safer if you don't come back." And the silence from the Kremlin was worse than refusal. It was indifference. That was the moment the elite realized something they never imagined. Putin's system was no longer designed to protect them. It was designed to survive them. In authoritarian regimes, wealth does not guarantee power, it guarantees utility. And the second an oligarch becomes less useful than dangerous, they become expendable. Not by slander, not by law, but by accident. The kind of accident that happens on balconies, on private jets, at remote resorts, on empty stairwells, in hospitals with no witnesses. When rich men begin to die from unexplained falls, poisonings, drownings, strokes, and heart attacks in private swimming pools, other rich men do not wait for explanations. They begin planning routes to anywhere else. And that is exactly what's happening now. Confidential flights from private Moscow airfields, multi-step routes through the Caucasus, the Middle East, the Balkans, crypto asset liquidations. Foreign citizenship bought quietly, not celebrated publicly. And perhaps the most striking sign, families are leaving first. When wives and children relocate without media coverage, when bodyguards move before their employers, when school enrollments shift to Dubai, Abu Dhabi, Tel Aviv, Singapore, or Buenos Aires, that is not business strategy. That is escape protocol. Inside Russia, Putin's circle is shrinking. Those who once sat at the table now sit at a distance. Meetings that used to be filled with confidence are now filled with interrogative eyes, suspicious silences, and sudden disappearances from agenda schedules. The fear is no longer about losing wealth. It's about losing time. Because for the first time since the early 2000s, the oligarchs are asking a question they never dared to voice. Did we build a fortress or a prison? And outside the Kremlin walls, the consequences are accelerating. Russia's currency has become a hostage of political dread. State-owned industries are suffocating under corruption they can no longer afford to hide. Military losses are turning from numbers into narratives that even propaganda cannot fully sanitize. And the remaining elites, the ones who haven't fled yet, now face the most dangerous position of all, being too close to a leader who is running out of exits. When powerful men believe the system is collapsing, they do not wait to see if they're correct. They act as though they know. And when the pillars leave, the palace falls, even if its walls still look intact. Pause here. Reply continue for part 2 to 1,000 words. You said, yes, ChatGPT said. Continuing part 2 to 1,000 words. No headings, no timestamps, no chapter markers. Inside the Kremlin, a new atmosphere has settled. Not the fierce loyalty of a dominant regime, but the quiet panic of a leadership that senses history no longer bends in its direction. Putin, once the unchallenged conductor of Russia's elite orchestra, now watches as his most valuable musicians slip silently off stage. These are not activists, not dissidents, not opposition bloggers hiding abroad. These are billionaires, industrialists, shipping magnates, energy barons, the custodians of Russia's wealth and the architects of its global influence. When they start leaving, it's not politics anymore, it's prognosis. Russian intelligence services have begun monitoring not only political opponents, but their own billionaire class, their travel patterns, digital communications, asset transfers, and even subtle behavior shifts like selling art, closing private clubs, reducing security staff, or moving priceless family heirlooms out of the country. That is not financial planning. That is lifeboat inventory. Sources close to Russia's business community say oligarchs no longer speak about winning the war or even restoring business access. Their new language is darker, more urgent. Transition, safe jurisdiction, contingency passports, and the chilling phrase, we need to prepare for what comes after him. That sentiment alone, whispered behind marble doors and tinted windows, marks the beginning of the endgame for every authoritarian system. Because the elite have finally recognized the truth that ordinary Russians sensed long ago. Vladimir Putin's power has stopped protecting Russia's future and has begun protecting only Putin's survival. The shift became undeniable the moment Putin replaced long-term planning with short-term control. Instead of developing economic stability, the government began freezing capital flows. Instead of incentivizing innovation, it nationalized private sectors. Instead of empowering markets, it strengthened security forces. That is, the logic of a regime preparing not to lead, but to outlive its own collapse. This has created a two-tiered fear system inside Russia. Ordinary citizens fear the police, the courts, and the propaganda machinery. But the elite, the rich, the connected, the privileged, they fear something more unpredictable. The moment Putin decides they are liabilities. Because when a regime begins to sink, it does not look outward for enemies, it looks inward. Suddenly, oligarchs with ties abroad appear suspicious. Those with foreign investments appear disloyal. Those who question war spending appear subversive. Those who ask about negotiation appear treasonous. And those who advocate de-escalation appear conspiratorial. If you are wealthy, intelligent, internationally connected, and privately skeptical, congratulations, you have become the most dangerous person in Putin's Russia. Meanwhile, as the war drains resources and global sanctions tighten like industrial clamps around Russia's financial arteries, the Kremlin has begun forcing oligarchs to donate funds, transfer shares to state-controlled entities, and finance patriotic infrastructure projects that will never return profit. These gestures are described publicly as solidarity. Privately, they are understood as hostage payments. This is why, even among those who once swore lifelong loyalty, an unspoken realization has taken root. Putin will sacrifice anyone to preserve the illusion of strength. And illusions, like wars, demand constant victims. Over the past year, more than a dozen high-ranking Russian business figures have died under extraordinary and unexplained circumstances. Some fell from balconies. Some reportedly committed suicide in ways that defy logic. Others died while entire security teams claimed no knowledge of the incident. Still others perished with their families, as if someone wanted to erase the possibility of future claims. The Kremlin denies foul play, but fear is not built from proof, it's built from patterns. That pattern is now strong enough that Russia's elite no longer speak about survival inside Russia, they speak about survival outside it. In private circles, oligarchs ask one another a series of questions that did not exist 5 years ago. Which mountain is safest, the Alps or the Andes? Which citizenship is harder to revoke, Emirati or Argentine? What is the fastest way to leave Moscow at 3 a.m. without detection? And the most telling question of all, which reputation is easier to rebuild, traitor or accomplice? Because once the world associates you with a collapsing regime, the stain follows you not through borders, but through history. Meanwhile, inside Russia's intelligence agencies, paranoia is blooming faster than loyalty. The Kremlin's own inner guard, the men trained not to question orders, now ask quietly whether they are protecting a president or inheriting a sinking ship. When bodyguards start looking for escape paths, you are no longer securing a palace, you are securing a lifeboat. At the same time, Russia's propaganda machine has become more frantic. Gone are the triumphant speeches boasting of unstoppable national progress. Gone are the confident declarations that Western sanctions have failed. Instead, the new messaging is defensive, brittle, repetitive. When a regime repeats the phrase, "everything is under control," it is because it can no longer prove it. In regions outside Moscow, frustration is shifting into resentment. Workers go unpaid. Supply chains disintegrate. Medical facilities ration basic drugs. Engineers leave the country. Teachers vanish into foreign work visas. Scientists change their names to secure international contracts. And through it all, the Kremlin insists the country is strong, the leader is stable, but Russia is experiencing a phenomenon it cannot admit publicly: white-collar flight, the collapse of intellectual loyalty, the evaporation of brain trust. And once a country loses its managers, analysts, scientists, architects, cybersecurity talent, and financial strategists, it does not decline, it rusts. Yet the most dangerous shift is not material, it is psychological. The oligarchs once believed Putin was eternal. Then they believed he was unshakable. Now they believe he is replaceable. That is the most volatile belief in autocratic politics, because once a ruler is viewed as replaceable, several new paths appear: succession, negotiation, defection, or collaboration with outside mediation. And every one of those paths ends with the same truth. Putin is no longer the guarantee of Russian stability, he is now the risk factor. Pause here. Reply continue when you're ready for part 3 to 1,000 words. You said yes. ChatGPT said, continuing part 3 to 1,000 words. Same tone, no headings, no timestamps, no chapter markers, across the highest levels of Russia's government and private sector. A silent question now hangs over every private dinner, every encrypted message, every hushed hallway conversation. What happens when the system built around one man becomes unsustainable, but that man refuses to leave? That is the moment where history stops being gradual and starts being explosive. Not with riots in the streets, not with crowds storming parliament, but with quiet splits among those who once whispered only loyalty. Revolutions rarely begin with the poor. They begin when the powerful decide that changing the ruler is safer than staying loyal to him. You can sense this tension in Russia's capital. The luxury stores remain illuminated, but the customers are gone. The private restaurants no longer play loud music because loud environments make it harder to hear who is sitting behind you. Chauffeurs drive slowly, not because of traffic, but because every unfamiliar vehicle could belong to an agency gathering evidence. Even the laughter among Russia's elite has changed. It is short, cautious, and almost always followed by a glance to ensure no one else heard it. In the Kremlin, this atmosphere of muted fear has transformed Putin from a charismatic central figure into something very different, a liability that cannot be removed, yet no longer trusted. And when a leader sees distrust everywhere, the first instinct is not diplomacy, it is preemptive control. That is why the government has tightened exit rules, expanded surveillance laws, seized more private investments, and quietly instructed border agents to flag certain passengers for delayed clearance. In an ordinary country, that is called security screening. In Putin's Russia, it is called permission to leave the empire. Oligarchs know there are only three ways out of a crumbling authoritarian regime: negotiation, disappearance, or exile. And the only one that allows them to protect family, wealth, and legacy is the last. That is why private jets that once flew from Moscow to London now chart routes through Kazakhstan, Armenia, Azerbaijan, the Gulf states, or Central and South America. No route is direct, no movement announced, no travel companions trusted unless bound by blood. Because in modern Russia, your closest business partner can become your interrogator by morning. The shift is visible even in language. 5 years ago, Russian elites spoke openly of our future. Now they speak cautiously of options, timelines, and safe separation. That is not optimism. That is risk mitigation. And while the outside world watches Putin's speeches for clues, the real signals are happening in silence, in the lawyers hired, the properties sold, the school transfers, the sudden citizenships obtained through countries that offer legal invisibility. A dictator can survive losing land, losing battles, or losing polls, but he cannot survive losing the belief of those who fund him. Inside Russia's intelligence and military infrastructure, officers have started performing their own private calculus. They ask themselves, if the elite are leaving, if the economy is shrinking, if the war is draining resources faster than they can be replenished, how long can the illusion of invincibility survive? And more importantly, what happens to those who are still inside when the music stops? Because power, like oxygen, does not simply disappear. It flows, it rearranges, it seeks a new container. And when it moves, it does not move gently. Meanwhile, there is another group watching the oligarch exodus with growing awareness. Russian citizens who once believed wealth was eternal and loyalty was rewarded. They are beginning to realize that even the most powerful men in the country are preparing escape plans, while ordinary people are being told to endure sacrifice as patriotic duty. It raises a question the Kremlin has no safe answer for. If the elites are running for safety, why should anyone else stay loyal? When the shepherds abandon the flock does not blame wolves, it questions the shepherds. The cracks are widening in another unexpected place: the Russian Orthodox Church. For years, the church leadership publicly aligned itself with Putin, reinforcing the image of a divine national mission. But recently, even among clergy, quiet skepticism has emerged. They feel the public's disillusionment, they hear confessions filled with despair, and they recognize that faith can only survive when it is separate from political decay. If the church stops providing unquestioned spiritual validation, the Kremlin loses one of its most potent emotional shields. And then there is the younger generation, the children of oligarchs, ministers, bankers, and top military officials. They were educated abroad. They speak multiple languages. They invest in foreign tech startups. They grew up with unlimited wealth and unrestricted perspective. And they are asking their parents a question that no authoritarian ruler once whispered: why should we return? When a nation loses its future heirs, it does not collapse tomorrow, but it guarantees collapse someday. As the oligarchs flee, Putin's inner circle has grown noticeably smaller, like a tightening spiral. The most loyal remain, but loyalty in a shrinking circle is not strength, it is entrapment disguised as honor. The men who once felt privileged to sit near Putin now feel trapped by proximity, because the closer you are to a collapsing ruler, the fewer exits you are allowed to use. The political class has not turned against Putin publicly, not yet, but you can see uncertainty in their eyes during televised meetings. Their smiles are delayed, their claps are half-hearted, their posture more rigid. No one wants to appear too eager, too confident, or too relaxed, because any display of comfort can be interpreted as arrogance, disloyalty, or secret planning. When a political elite learns that appearing too safe can be dangerous, they are not loyal supporters anymore, they are controlled hostages. One of the most striking developments has emerged among Russia's security officials. A subtle shift from protecting Putin's power to protecting themselves from Putin's downfall. They are no longer planning how to preserve the regime, they are planning how to survive its end. And that change is irreversible, because once fear stops flowing downward and begins flowing upward, it changes the gravitational center of power. The oligarchs have now become the canaries in the geopolitical coal mine. When canaries escape or die, miners do not accuse the birds they sprint for the exit. Russia's elite have stopped singing. Pause here. Reply continue for part 4 to 1,000 words. You said, yes. ChatGPT said, continuing part 4 to 1,000 words, same tone, same pacing, no headings or timestamps. Outside Russia, foreign governments, intelligence agencies, and financial regulators have begun quietly tracking the steady flow of Russian elite capital, not out of curiosity, but out of recognition that money leaves before regimes fall. Patterns are emerging. Hedge funds in Singapore suddenly expanding Russian clientele, real estate purchases hidden through layered shell companies in Cyprus and Panama, abrupt acquisitions of safe rural properties in South America, and highly sophisticated crypto laundering operations designed not to conceal wealth, but to untether it permanently from Russia's jurisdiction. Wealth is not fleeing because of loss, it is fleeing because of anticipated seizure. And what terrifies the Kremlin more than sanctions is the realization that its own billionaires are no longer betting on Russia, they are betting on not returning. Internally, Putin continues projecting confidence, delivering speeches framed around resilience, national destiny, and historical struggle. But his tone has shifted. Where he once spoke as a leader guiding a confident nation, he now speaks as a man, reminding the country that punishment awaits those who doubt him. He no longer persuades, he warns. And warnings do not demonstrate power, they signal vulnerability. Meanwhile, inside Russia's fading business hubs, Moscow, St. Petersburg, Yekaterinburg, Novosibirsk, the energy has changed. The once relentless rhythm of investment pitches, luxury conferences, gala dinners, and tech incubators has been replaced by the soft tap of exit strategies being written in silence. Lawyers specializing in corporate expansion now quietly market expertise in inheritance law, divorce, relocation, and political asylum. Financial advisors no longer recommend new ventures. They recommend secure disengagement. To the Kremlin, this shift represents disloyalty. To the oligarchs, it represents survival. To historians, it represents the pre-collapse stage of authoritarian decay. The Russian population senses it too. Though state media censors the exodus, chatter spreads through family connections, social apps, and encrypted messaging. The narrative of patriotic sacrifice collapses the moment ordinary Russians learn that the men demanding loyalty aren't staying for the consequences. A soldier cannot be convinced to die for a nation whose rulers are trying to live somewhere else, and this introduces a dangerous psychological chain reaction. Once the public realizes that elite wealth is no longer tied to the nation's future, trust in the social contract evaporates. That is when countries do not just lose stability, they lose purpose. When ideology no longer inspires and patriotism no longer motivates, authoritarian governments turn to their final, most primitive tool, fear. We are now witnessing that transition. Russia has expanded its domestic surveillance capabilities, making online anonymity nearly impossible without specialized tools. Intellectual dissent is treated not as criticism, but as espionage. University professors are warned not to discuss geopolitics. Corporate employees are instructed to monitor peers for unpatriotic language. Even school children are gently conditioned to view skepticism as betrayal. But forced patriotism does not create loyalty. It burns whatever loyalty remains. At the same time, regional governors who once acted as confident intermediaries between Moscow and civilian life have become increasingly fragile. They fear that economic underperformance may be interpreted as disloyalty, while loyalty without results may be interpreted as incompetence. In such a climate, officials stop governing and start self-preserving. Decisions become defensive. Projects stall. Innovation collapses. And when no one wants to be responsible for failure, failure accelerates. Putin, aware of this shrinking perimeter of reliability, now cultivates a smaller and smaller circle of absolute loyalists. But this is exactly how authoritarian regimes die, not with mass uprising, but with terminal isolation at the top. When a ruler trusts only a few, he receives only the information those few choose. And when information is filtered through fear, it becomes fiction. Make no mistake, Putin remains dangerous. Systems in decline often become more violent, not less. But danger and durability are not the same. A cornered animal can still bite, but it cannot rebuild its cage. Outside Russia, the oligarchs who have successfully relocated are now engaged in a new type of diplomacy, reputation bargaining. Some fund humanitarian causes to distance themselves from Kremlin legacy. Others invest in Western startups to be viewed as global, not Russian. A few are writing memoirs through ghostwriters, attempting to recast themselves as reluctant participants rather than eager beneficiaries. All of it is constructed for one reason: to survive the judgment of history. This raises the next critical question. What happens when Russia's wealthiest people are no longer invested financially, politically, or emotionally in Russia itself? Without oligarch loyalty, the Kremlin loses. Global leverage, internal funding buffers, business infrastructure expertise, elite propaganda reinforcement, silent international lobby networks. And that loss has already begun to echo into Russia's cultural consciousness. Artists, filmmakers, writers, and musicians, once weaponized as symbols of national pride, now feel their futures evaporating at the same rate as their country's creative oxygen. When art flees alongside wealth, a nation does not merely lose culture, it loses identity continuity. In private, some oligarchs admit something even darker. They are not afraid that Russia will change, they are afraid that it will not. They fear that Putin's grip will remain strong enough to punish, but not strong enough to rebuild. That is the most terrifying political scenario: a ruler powerful enough to destroy, but too isolated to repair. Meanwhile, the Kremlin is running out of narratives. The promise of greatness has faded. The promise of victory is unfulfilled. The promise of stability is broken. And when promises die, systems follow. A new phrase is now circulating quietly among Russia's elite, not in public speeches, but in private chats, whispered phone calls, and encrypted forums. It is no longer safe to stay loyal. That sentence is not merely fear, it is forecast. Pause here. Reply continue for part 5 final to 1,000 words. You said, yes, ChatGPT said. Continuing part 5 to 1,000 words. Same tone, no headings, no timestamps, no chapter markers. This will conclude the 4,500, 5,000 word script. And so the final stage of this unfolding crisis is not defined by tanks, protests, or dramatic televised resignations. It is defined by institutional hollowing, the process by which a government appears intact on the outside, yet is quietly abandoned from within. The buildings remain, the flags remain, the anthem remains. The speeches continue, but the invisible scaffolding of confidence that held it all upright is now dissolving. No regime collapses the moment it is doubted, but every regime collapses the moment it is no longer believed in. Something profound is shifting inside Russia. The population no longer looks at the Kremlin and sees direction. They see duration. And duration is not leadership, it is stagnation, wearing the mask of endurance. When people live under a system, not because they trust it, but because they see no alternative, legitimacy becomes a ghost that everyone still pretends to see. And in that fragile space between endurance and disbelief, new and often dangerous actors begin to imagine themselves as the answer. This is where Russia now stands. Inside the intelligence agencies, 2 unspoken questions linger like fog in a sealed room. What if the president is the problem? And what if someone else thinks they are the solution? No one says those words aloud. No one writes them down. But they exist now, floating like static in the heads of men who have been trained for decades to solve problems using force, secrecy, and silence. When a system reaches that level of internal questioning, history stops being linear and becomes volatile. Because once the idea that leadership can change enters the bloodstream of the elite, change becomes inevitable, whether through negotiation, attrition, exile, staged transition, or something far more unplanned. Meanwhile, ordinary Russians are not preparing for revolution, they are preparing for uncertainty. They are stocking food, they are limiting investments, they are withdrawing savings, they are canceling long-term purchases, they are taking online language classes, they are renewing passports. They are watching other countries the way earlier generations watched weather patterns. These are not protests. These are preparations for instability. And once a population prepares for instability, stability is already gone. On state television, officials insist Russia is strong. But outside the frame, the oligarchs are moving assets, the youth are moving identities, and the future is moving somewhere else. A nation does not collapse when people stop fighting for it. It collapses when people stop planning their future inside it. The Kremlin still believes it can reclaim unity through threats, punishment, and patriotic theater, but loyalty cannot be resurrected by fear. You can force silence. You cannot force belief. Internationally, Russia's dwindling alliances are not alliances of trust, they are alliances of mutual convenience. And convenience evaporates the moment one side becomes too costly to maintain. Several nations are already diversifying away from Russian energy, Russian defense partnerships, and Russian banking channels. No ally wants to be tied to a ship whose captain refuses to acknowledge that the hull is already taking water. The Kremlin calls this temporary strain. Strategists call it a slow geopolitical orphaning. Inside the few oligarch circles that still meet quietly in villas, saunas, and underground lounges, a final once unthinkable debate is emerging. Who inherits Russia if Putin cannot remain forever? Not if when. That question marks the psychological death of every autocracy. Once succession becomes discussable, stability becomes terminally delayed. Some elites imagine a controlled transition. Others imagine a negotiated exile. A few imagine chaos that will cleanse the system. But no one, not even the most fervent loyalists, imagines the current trajectory continuing without consequence. Because even those who defend Putin privately acknowledge one truth. A nation cannot run indefinitely on fear, secrecy, and narrative while bleeding its future through every border it cannot fully close. And now, here is where the story turns from analysis to something deeper, something that every historian, journalist, and citizen must eventually confront. The fate of nations is not decided by how loudly leaders speak, but by how quietly the powerful begin to leave the room. Tonight, as we watch Russia, we are not just witnessing political conflict or wartime pressure. We are watching the slow-motion unraveling of a personalist system built on wealth, intimidation, and unwavering loyalty. And the moment loyalty becomes a risk rather than a currency, the structure collapses inward like a cathedral whose foundation was hollowed out while the roof was still shining. The departing oligarchs are not just fleeing danger. They are signaling no confidence in the empire they helped build. And when the builders walk away, the walls do not stand for long. So the question for Russia is not simply whether Putin remains in power, but what remains after his power stops working. Because governments can survive war, they can survive sanctions, they can survive protests, but they cannot survive abandonment at the top, distrust in the middle, and hopelessness at the bottom, all at the same time. And that is what Russia faces tonight. Not immediate explosion, but inevitable implosion. Not sudden collapse, but quiet disintegration. Not dramatic overthrow, but the slow evaporation of belief. And when belief dies, regimes die long before the public funeral. So remember this. A throne built from loyalty can last decades. A throne built from fear can last years. But a throne built from nothing left to trust cannot survive the sound of footsteps leaving. I'm Rachel Maddow. Thank you for being here tonight. And wherever history turns next, watch carefully who is running toward the future and who is running away from it.